Welcome, fellow Starship builders, to Chapter 12 of Walker Street Shipyards. As I detailed in Chapter 9, when I install the completed shuttle bay assembly into the secondary hull, there is a build progression of steps leading up to having everything in place for the shuttle bay to slide into place into the hull components. Since this is such a huge build with so many sprawling assembly steps, when you get started on the build and throughout the assembly, you have to work on different portions concurrently, or it would take forever to build this thing. After all of the light blocking, as I worked on the shuttle bay, the photo etch pieces, the arboretum, and the officer's lounge, I was also working on the upper saucer lighting and detail painting, such as the bridge dome painting, hull painting on the secondary hull and lower saucer, wire and light placement in the secondary hull, and then beginning the tenant control circuitry board process, which meant starting by soldering what seemed like dozens of resistors to the LEDs that come with that circuitry board. A lot goes on at once. But when it's time to install the shuttle bay, you have to follow this kit's marching orders, which meant setting the arboretum windows, and then setting the arboretum, and then the shuttle bay is on top of that, and then the nacelle pylons have to be attached before you close up the top of the hull, and then you set the dorsal. But after that sort of rigid by-the-numbers process, the build process can become a little less linear, although still sort of orderly. For example, I haven't even started on the nacelles and those darn chiller grills. So for me, the next portion of this build I want to achieve is mounting the lower portion of the saucer to the dorsal. Why just the lower portion of the saucer? As I hinted at the end of Chapter 11, I have thought about this and I'm actually following another builder's example. I'll get to that later in the chapter. But before I mount the lower saucer, I'm going to start with portions of the Aztec decaling and a little of the registry and pinstriping decaling. For that, let's head down to the lower planetary sensor and out into the hull to begin the hull plating. And while we're at it, let's say hello and wave to the crewmen in the back of the shuttle bay working in the cargo area. Before making our way down to the planetary sensor at the bottom of the lower saucer and making our way out onto the hull to begin hull plating, let's first stop in at the rec deck. Now that we've assembled once again here in the rec deck, let's see what aftermarket supplies have come in to continue the build in this edition of Mail Call. This is the second edition in a row of Mail Call where we've gotten in lighting supplies from our friends at Evans Designs. This time I've gotten in these tiny square pico sized LEDs that are going to be used as the floodlights to cast light out through the windows of the lower planetary sensor at the bottom of the lower saucer. So there'll be a light placed here, 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 and here, and they will cast floodlights out through these tiny little windows. As I've mentioned numerous times throughout this build, a lot of the decals that come with the Polar Lights stock decal ship that is included with this kit can be problematic and really, quite frankly, heart attack inducing. Most notable are these little red circles that go around the navigation light and the strobe lights on different portions of the hull. So I have been on a hunt for decal sheets that will reproduce these. I also wanted to find replacements for these, which are the pinstripes, red pinstripes that go on the dorsal neck. Basically the way I did these on the first build is I anticipated trouble and I just cut them into little teeny pieces and put them down and stitched them together because I just knew that they were probably going to come to pieces. Fortunately, through JT Graphics, I have found a registry marking set which includes a lot of these with the exception of the little red navigation light circles. And as I mentioned in Chapter 11's Mail Call, through HCA Model Works, I found the pinstripes that go on the top of the bridge dome. But I still was on the hunt for these little rings, And so I went on a system-wide journey through known Federation space to try to hunt down a decal sheet that would replicate these. I started with Cass at Lake Monster Decals, who makes excellent product, and I've actually got some of Cass's aftermarket decals, which are included in portions of this build. Who said unfortunately he did not have a specific sheet that had those pinstripes or had those little red circles. From there I checked with Jonathan at Marshall Models, who said didn't really do decals and didn't have a sheet like that, but recommended that I reach out to Mike at Vagabond Decals. Reached out to Mike, who makes some really cool looking decals, but he said that he doesn't do anything specific to the 350 refit, but then mentioned Gus at Decals. So I reached out to Gus, let him know what I needed, and he specially designed and printed this set, which includes the little red circles that go around the strobes and navigation light, which includes the red pinstripes that go on the dorsal. It also has some other things that I've got duplicated in other aftermarket sheets, like the aforementioned HDA pinstripes for the bridge dome, also these little multicolored squares that go around the emergency hatches across the top of the saucer. Some of these other markings that go in different places, but I'm really glad to now have my hands on these little circles. I discovered, as it turns out, that the Starship building community located in Federation Systems is a lot more interconnected than I had imagined, because when I finally did reach out to Gus, and he produced this fantastic set of decals specific to what I needed, and I sent him my shipping information. He messaged back to say that actually he used to live in the city where I now live, and actually was located just about 45 minutes away in the same state, very close to me. So it really is interconnected Federation space, and after going on that large journey to track down someone to make these decals, it found out that it was someone really almost in my own backyard. Back in the very first chapter, I talked about this piece and mentioned that this kit came with the option of choosing between two different lower sections, lower hull sections for the secondary hull, depending on whether you wanted to build the Enterprise from Star Trek: The Motion Picture or from subsequent editions. Now, really, the difference between these pieces is minimal. It really just comes down to a single scribed line in this section right here. But, you know, I'm a purist, I guess, so I wanted to stick with the piece that would best simulate the Enterprise from Star Trek: The Motion Picture. So I mentioned that when you have one piece left over, this is a really useful piece to do testing because it is so large and you have a lot of surface area on it. You can test different paint colors, you can test different sealants and different finishes, and of course different decals. So I decided to break out this piece as it's been sitting in the beginning of the box for nearly a year and do some A/B testing for decals. And see, A and B. What I did was from here forward, I hit with Tamiya gloss coat, 2 coats of Rattlecan Tamiya gloss coat. From here backward, Tamiya semi-gloss. Then experimented with this decal is one of the Polar Lights stock decals. It's their green tinted Aztec decaling. This is a decal that would go on the bottom of the deflector dish housing. Then I use this B from the Aztec kit, again to try to determine how well they were going to seat on a gloss finish. And so the Polar Light's stock piece went down really easily on the gloss, gave me a pretty good degree of maneuverability. I was able to scoot it around a little bit before it really started to fasten itself down. The Aztec decal, these Aztec decals, it is a thicker type of, I guess, vinyl material than the regular stock decals, and you have a lot more flexibility. They're a lot more durable. You still need to use caution to make sure that you don't tear them or rip them or fold them, but you have a little bit more flexibility in using them. So this Aztec B went down really easily. I had a great degree of maneuverability in moving it around. Now, on this side, the semi-gloss side, this light gray is the Aztec decal. Again, it's the same piece as here, it's just a different color. It is the piece that goes on the bottom of the deflector dish. Laid down very easily, still, even though this was a semi-gloss, a lot of maneuverability. However, the stock Polar Lights decal that came off the stock sheet, as soon as this A hit the semi-gloss surface, it wanted to bond right away. There was no degree of maneuverability when I put it down, and because I'm a little bit skittish about torquing and stressing those stock decals too much, I didn't want to try to push it around for fear of ripping it, so I let it stay in place. So the good news is you got a nice finish, no seal ring or anything, and it did lay down well. But you need to make sure, if you're going to use semi-gloss, that you take these stock decals and put them down exactly where they're going to go. This is one of the circles that is a G-cal. I wanted to test those G-cals to make sure that I understood how they would be used. And as Gus promised, they act like any other water slide decals. They're very easy to put down. This is one of the alternate ship names that comes with the Polar Lights Aztec decals, and I wanted to put this down mostly because I like the name Defiant. If I were going to go with anything other than Enterprise, I would definitely call this ship the Defiant, because this kit itself, I can't think of a better name for this kit than Defiant, because it is definitely defiant of any attempts for an easy build. So, having done my A/B testing and learned the results, it's time to move on to doing the Aztecing on the inner circle of the lower saucer. The Polar Lights Aztec decals are a sort of, maybe kind of aftermarket set of decals for the 350 refit kit. Now, I say that because it's my understanding that the original release of this kit, and maybe a few subsequent releases, the Polar Lights Aztecs were included as part of the kit, but following that, they had to be ordered separately. I sort of understand that because this is an enormous set of decals, and they're fairly pricey. There's 5 huge sheets with really hundreds of decals, and they're really a fantastic set of decals. They give a lot of detail to replicate the plating effect, the whole plating effect for this kit. And even though that I've complained some about the stock decals that do come with the kit, a lot of the registry decals and pinstriping, and those little red circles, the Aztec decals made by Polar Lights are more durable. They're easier to work with. You have a little bit more flexibility in putting them down and moving them around. You have a little bit more time in using them. So they are a fantastic set of decals. And like I said, they are instrumental in adding the plating effect that you'll see over the hull. You can see I've installed the ones here on the dorsal already, and you can see some of that effect. We'll talk about that in just a bit. So why have I determined at this stage of the build to begin the Aztec decaling on the lower saucer, and why only this inner ring and not around the outer edges? Good question. One of the primary goals that I have for this build, and really actually for the first build as well, is to minimize turning the ship upside down, even more so with build number 2 than build number 1. I don't want to torque a lot of those wire placements. and lighting placements that are crammed inside the different hull areas, the saucers, the secondary hull. Also, I'm more than a little bit worried about those little figures, the paragraphics photo etch figures that are in the officer's lounge and the arboretum and the shuttle bay. The glue points on their tiny little feet are so minuscule that there's really not a lot of fixing them, and I'm just a little bit worried that if they were completely upside down, it may aid in them cracking loose and falling down. In the officer's lounge, I saw one of them that was beginning to list just a little bit, and I touched it with the probe to try to get him to stand up straight, and he just like fell over and came off of the flooring. So I really want to try to figure out how I can execute this build without turning the ship upside down. There is a degree of complexity in laying down the first of the Aztec decals, particularly the ones that are here in the lower saucer. They really need to go down before you permanently affix the lower planetary sensor. And it's just a lot easier to do them if you've got this piece turned upside down, which of course, once I attach it to the top of the dorsal, to the top of the secondary hull, then as I said, I really don't want to turn it upside down. I'm going to do just this inner portion. For one thing, Polar Lights recommends that when using these decals, that they are long, kind of delta-shaped panels that fit around the rim of the saucer, around the saucer. And they recommend cutting them in half, which is one of the things that I discovered in the first build, that it makes it a lot easier to place them exactly where they need to go. If they're cut in half, it minimizes any opportunity for mistakes and for damaging the decals. So you can see that I already, just for the sake of refamiliarizing myself, laid the first two, and then I'm going to continue around here. And that's as far as I'm going to get before I finish up the lower planetary sensor and then glue this piece to the dorsal. Why am I stopping at this point? Because as other builders of this kit know, one of the most problematic areas for light leaks is around the rim of the saucer. Once you attach the two saucer pieces together, there is almost no way prior to gluing those together to mitigate a light leak around that rim. So that means that once the saucer halves go together, there is a lot of puttying, a lot of sanding, and a lot of painting. One of the things about the decal, any of the decaling, is even after you put them down, even after you set them with microsol, even after you give them a couple coats of a finishing spray, anything adhesive that touches these decals is going to rip them and pull them up. So that really eliminates any opportunity for masking in this outer area here. You don't want to do painting with your decals that go around the edge, because then you're going to paint your decals, but then you can't mask your decals because any type of masking material, masking tape, is going to peel them up. So by bringing them out just to this grid line, give me the opportunity that when it comes time to do that final touch-up painting, when I've puttied around that light leaked edge of the saucer, I've got some area right here that I could attach masking material and mask this interior section. So there are two different large sheets for the saucer Aztec decals. Sheet 1 is going to be the top, and they are broken out into different sections 2 and 4, and the bottom is sheet 2 that is broken out in two different sections, 1 and 3. And recommend that you begin right here just to the left of this well, this piece right here, and work your way around, really either clockwise or counterclockwise. I'm doing it counterclockwise. You'll start with sheet 1, sheet 3, decal 1, decal 3, decal 1, decal 3. And that, for example, this is decal 1, this is decal 3, this is decal 1, and again, as recommended, I'm going to cut through it probably right about here and lay down just this top section. And then what I'll do, because it's going to be a while before I'll get around to using the rest, is just write on the back here number 1 to let me know that this is the number 1 segment. So for the two portions that I've already cut off these, this one I have written on the back 3, this one I have written on the back 1, so that when I finally get back to finishing out the Aztec decaling here, then I'll know which section goes where. Now there is a little bit of, let's see if I can get a good focus here, excuse me. There's a little bit of variability into exactly where this decal is going to go and start. Side to side, it's a lot easier because you pretty much are going to use the sides of the decal sheet to correspond with the grid lines. This very first one, a portion of it, a little teeny portion of it, is going to overlap and fall into this well, and what you do is you just wait till it completely dries and then take your hobby knife and go and slice that out. So what I determined was the best way to determine exactly where it's going to lay is by looking along this line here. You've got your plating sections here, but then you've got these long narrow lines that run up, and if you take your individual sections and start them right here along this grid line, I think that will lead the best result, and that also helps make sure that when the planetary sensor is finally affixed, that it covers just those top edges. And so here's the completed inner ring of the Polar Lights Aztec decals applied to the lower saucer. Looks pretty fantastic. I have also applied the Aztec decaling to the lower planetary sensor. The lights that come on look fantastic, and when it's darker, they project really great triangular floodlights out onto the hull. I have also applied the JT Graphics registry decals, and so the lower saucer is looking really shipshape. So here's the Polar Lights Aztec decal applied to the dorsal. This is the starboard side, and I've also applied it to the Aztec decaling to the port side as well. I really love the look that the Aztec decal gives, the subtle coloration and the plating effect, and can't wait to see when it's applied all across the secondary hull. One of the things that I recommend in putting down the dorsal portion of the Aztec decal is to cut it into two pieces. On the actual decal sheet, it is one continuous piece, and there are a lot of weird surfaces. There's this little angled notch here, there's this long curved bow, this curved section down here, and actually the top of the neck is a little bit curved as well. And it can be a real challenge to try to lay this down as one continuous decal. Fortunately, you've got this nice hard defined line right here at the turbo lift. So what I did was I cut it right here at this hard line so that I had two decals, a forward section and a rear section. So I laid down from this pale blue turbo lift portion forward. It's actually a bit of a challenge, and it takes some nudging to get these lines straight, to get the decal line lined up with the etched lines that are in the part. But that's one of the reasons why it's great to have a smaller section to put down, and then when it's dried, to put down the lower section. Actually had a bit of a problem and ran into a bit of an issue with this back section. It crumpled very badly right here. I also had it tear right here near this window, tore a little bit down here at the bottom, but I was able to use cocktail toothpicks, a fine model paintbrush, and applications of water to very gently stitch everything back together, and finally got it all together, so you can't really tell that I had those problems. Now, speaking of water, when I was talking about putting the Aztec decals down on the lower saucer, I recommended using a lot of water, which is also what the instruction sheet recommends. It's really not a problem on the lower saucer. There's not a lot of lights, there's not a lot of wiring in the lower saucer, and there's actually not a lot of windows. So it's pretty easy to use a lot of water. Here on the secondary hull, here on the dorsal, and certainly with all of the windows across the hull, I'm a little bit more cautious in using water because there's a lot of wires, and there's a lot of connections, and there's a lot of lights inside this hull. The last thing I want is water cascading down through these windows. So you still have to use water, just don't, I didn't drench it as much. I've also laid down the decal pinstriping. I tried to use the Pololites stock decals and was very cautious, but that decal still came apart right up here. It broke into a bunch of pieces that floated all over the place, and I had to just wipe it all away and use Gus's decal pinstriping, and it really came out looking fantastic. Now, the reason that I went ahead and did the dorsal Aztecing and the pinstriping just prior to laying down the lower saucer is, once that saucer is in place, it's an enormous piece, and it becomes very difficult to get head and hands up under it to do a lot of the work. It takes a bit of finesse and care getting the pinstriping in place, especially right up here at the front, and then, as I mentioned, in getting this Aztec decal in place. So it's a lot easier to do if you're not stooped over and have your head and your hands wedged up under that saucer. So I've achieved another big step in this build and have mounted the lower saucer to the dorsal neck. Why just the lower saucer? Well, I believe most builders of the 350 refit go ahead and attach the two saucer halves together as one component. It's certainly how I did it on my first build, and then at some point attach the completed saucer as one unit to the dorsal. The way I did it on my first build was to turn the saucer upside down, turn the secondary hull upside down, and mount them that way, sort of let gravity work in your favor. Completely understand that, and throughout this build was really thinking I would work in that direction. But I was going back and looking at Boyd and Matt's build series on how they did it, and in looking at part 20 of Matt's build, I noticed this shot and saw that he had done that build by mounting the lower saucer on its own, and then at a later date came back and mounted the top saucer half to the lower. I reached out to Matt, messaged him back and forth about the pros and cons of doing it this way. So this is, here are a few of the reasons why I did it this way. One is to give myself a little bit of breathing room at this point so I can take a little bit more time with a lot of the wiring, a lot of the antenna control circuitry. There's a lot more lights that are going in the upper saucer than on my first build. A lot of those antenna controls, strobe lights, navigation lights, a lot more connections. Plus, I'm going to mount the antenna controls circuitry board somewhere in the lower saucer somewhere probably along in here. That'll give me more time to find the best spot for it. And then when I've got everything hooked up for the upper saucer, make a lot of the connections and have some more time and again more breathing room. Also, another good reason for mounting the lower saucer on its own before securing it to the top half is that the completed saucer is probably the heaviest component in this entire build. The 6 mounting pins at the top of the dorsal and the thin connecting point along the top curve of the neck constitutes a real load-bearing portion. By just connecting the lower saucer, which is the far less weighty portion of the saucer, there's less stresses and less forces trying to pull the seams apart as it cures. As with other high-load connections on this ship, I used Gorilla Grip 2-part epoxy and gave it 24 hours curing time. It took some ingenuity to come up with a way to secure and hold the saucer to the lower hull assembly with everything lifted in the air on top of the base supporting rod. This is another connection with no good means of clamping together, or at least that I could figure out. So I came up with this, hopefully Starfleet approved mounting assembly. Once the two pieces were firmly joined, I checked it with the level to make sure it was flat across the top. So now I have a good seam along the top of the dorsal neck, although there's, no surprise, a light leak peeking out of the joint on the starboard side. There's absolutely no leak along the port side, so yay, one less thing to do. I wanted to have this portion of the build complete and Chapter 12 posted over 2 weeks ago, but there's no way to hurry these critical build junctures, and I took my time and was very methodical in making sure I had everything ready. As I wrap up, I want to again thank Matt of Matt's Model Shop YouTube channel for taking the time to exchange messaging on the pros and cons of mounting the saucer this way. Of course, I won't really know if this is a better method until I finally join the upper saucer portion to the lower and seal the two pieces. I may end up just caving and turning it all upside down for that process. What's coming in the next chapter and the next stage of the build? Like I said at the start of this chapter, there's several different approaches I can take at this point. I really should get cracking on those nacelles and those darn infuriating chiller grills. But I also need to finalize installation of all the windows, strobe, and navigation lights on the upper saucer. Whichever path I chart next, thank you for following me on this journey to this point. If you enjoy this series, and hopefully I've gotten a few good pointers out of watching, please be sure and hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And so, please join me again for Chapter 13 of Walker Street Shipyards.